Welcome to Psychologist Talks. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking about a seeming erosion of trust in science and arguably expertise in general. And, there's points of frustration in this because there's a personal element to this, but I promise I've thought pretty significantly about it, that this is not just me being angry because I feel small or insignificant. I truly think there are societal implications to this sort of erosion of trust. Now, science/expertise, what do I even mean by that? Let's start with that. Well, science hopefully is obvious enough, but sciences are pretty expansive. And I don't know if people would typically define, the sciences as including things like anthropology, but I would. Things that you have to go get education for and there's research articles about is probably well enough labeled as science. There's various degrees of what we call kind of hardness or softness, quote unquote, in those sciences. But that, again, it should not be like a criticism. For example, me in the mental health field, psychology, some people try to levy the sort of criticism of it being a quote unquote soft science as though that's a bad thing. There's certainly aspects, and there's lots of scientists out there in this field that are trying to make it a harder science. But at the end of the day, we will always have a soft part of our science, and that is invaluable. It is absolutely important for there to be softness, because the human condition is filled with abstraction and art, and you will never, I don't care, if we've got quantum computing and 100 years of extra science, we will never drill it down to a perfect hard science, and that's a good thing. And so there's a wide array of this sort of stuff. Even history, if you consider it a science or just even an expertise, there's interpretation in history. But the act of a bunch of experts or scientists in the field coming together and trying to capture, this is kind of the anthropological lens to it, capture the gestalt, the overall sentiment of what was going on, is an important endeavor for present day learning. And yet, we'll kind of stop defining the science expertise piece, and yet we seem to be throwing this stuff out. Now, I don't think we've ever been excellent at consulting experts in our lives. I'm not trying to look back to our past and think of them as like glory days or something. We were, excellent at putting scientists and experts in positions of power and authority to be able to speak to the subject at hand. And there's been bias towards certain sciences and expertise. But I feel like we've become especially bad at it. and it feels like there's a number of reasons for it. On the one hand, how do I frame this? There's just seems to be this movement, and I would bargain if we telescope out far enough, and I was to talk to speak of the devil, historians or anthropologists and stuff, I'm sure we've been in this cycle before. We have a tendency as human beings to kind of move between the pendulum shall swing. And so I'm sure we've been here before when there's been kind of a shirking off of expertise and everybody just gets to be wherever they want to be. This sort of like, I'm going to focus in on me. I'm going to stop deferring so much to power and authority. Now, from a human perspective, there is some normalcy to this. Deference is an important quality in any society, yet an over-reliance on deference creates an imbalance in power structures. It's a very abstract concept, but I promise you, in societies where it's all about deference, the individual begins to disintegrate, which has its dangers. But to overcorrect and basically abandon science or abandon experts in the field and actively begin to distrust them is a little bit of an extreme overcorrection. So historically, I'm sure there's again this ebb and flow, the sort of pendulum swing that we tend to go through, and perhaps we're in another one of those. But there's something unique about this time where it feels like there's like some sort of fear and kind of catty corner to that anger, and like there's some sort of feared destruction of the self. And it's going to again be very abstract, that people often have this like anxiety around change, that something is being lost. Psychodynamically, It's sort of annihilation anxiety, this idea that we will lose ourselves and we will be destroyed as things change. And it stokes like a lot of fear. And a lot of people don't do very well with that fear. Some people will turn to straight up nihilism. They're not really enacting anything. They just stop caring. But others will transmute that into aggressive anger and projection and all sorts of stuff. And it feels like we're in this era where there's been this sudden projection of like, you're the enemy. Expertise is the enemy. Science is the enemy. You're trying to brainwash me. Like if you had been successful, you would have been successful by now. And now I'm going to distrust you. And that includes distrust of institutions, distrust of, basically anybody who disagrees with your particular opinion is put into kind of an encampment, or it's a faction or a clan that now becomes the enemy. It's an othering process. And in doing so, there's this like dissolution of the power of science and expertise. People who devote so much of their time and energy, they could be doing so many things, but at the expense of other things, they choose to narrow their focus on this one thing, and it suddenly doesn't matter. And it just puts us in a very, very dangerous position. A glaring example of this was COVID-19. Science is fallible, and I can guarantee you there are things that they screwed up during COVID-19, numerous things, but they did not screw up as much as some people seem to believe that they did screw up. There was this interesting split, this sort of polarity that you began to see, where we have these scientists and medical doctors going up and having to speak to these things to the larger public. And suddenly you had a camp that was like all about it. And then you had a camp that was nothing about it. They were like, no. Now, there were other power dynamics at play, bad actors that were essentially muddying the water for their own gains and their own sort of purposes. But at the end of the day, even independent of that, I think this sort of schism or this rift, you would have seen it. Not as bad as we saw it, but you still would have seen it. And I don't think we've been able to turn back from that. It like evoked these fears. Then again, people capitalized on those fears. And now we're at this point where like it doesn't matter anymore, and it was juxtaposed too by political movements, and we're talking here in the United States, that basically was like, I'm going to dissolve trust of all systems. That's where I get people maybe disliking and trying to tune me out because they think I'm being all liberal woke or something over here. But a certain side of our political spectrum has basically capitalized on fear, and their method of governing is through fear, not actual substance. And I will say that unequivocally and not politically, because that party was not always that way. And they need to come back to the fold. And so they've stoked these flames of distrust. Again, fear turned into anger and thereby distrust. And so COVID-19 already was brewing to a certain degree with that distrust. Now, all of a sudden, it's attached to the medical science. And we've not recovered from that terribly well. We haven't. And so you see just like, it's just this dissolution of trust and this giant rift forming where there's people who rely on science and there's people who reject it absolutely. And health is somewhere in between. You cannot over-rely on science. It's massively fallible. But it is a constellation. It represents a constellation in the sky to which you can turn, especially during times of need. So you need at least a somewhat healthy relationship with it. You cannot fully reject it. You also cannot treat it like a god. And we seem to be struggling with that quite immensely. Other examples and points of concern and just fascinating to me is the psychology of all of this, right? If you listen to what I'm saying, I'm analyzing how we get to these places psychologically. And yet, where are the psychologists? Where are the mental health experts speaking to this stuff? Historians and anthropologists could very well, I don't know. I don't know any. I need to go find some maybe. I wonder if they'd be able to attest to like, yeah, societies sometimes do this. And here's a perfect example from Europe or something. I don't know. I'm sure this has to have happened. Like I said earlier, I feel like there's a guarantee this has happened before. And they might have wisdom about this. Not everybody needs to be a versed historian to know these things. It would be beneficial for historians to come forward and be like, hey, we've been here to a certain degree before, and maybe you could turn to me as like someone who can like help that along. And so like us mental health professionals and psychologists, where are we during all of this? And we have seen a train wreck coming for a while psychologically in the general public, and nobody's speaking to it. Or if you go back to the COVID-19 example, they're talking about mental health crises, but a medical doctor is talking about them. Why are we doing that? And so this predates any of this sort of like, slow creep of distrust and expertise. Oftentimes, due to power differentials and just hierarchical systems, people who have expertise, their voices were not being adequately heard. And the consequence of that is usually if you don't have the people ready for when things hit the fan, it's already too late. This is why you put people in positions of power, trusted individuals. I mean, that's the other thing. You got to find people who are really trustworthy and good at doing this sort of stuff, but put them in proactively rather than reactively, because then you can mitigate the impact of these sorts of things. But once again, we haven't done a wonderful job with this sort of stuff. And now, with this distrust and this sort of growing schism and this sort of rift between, reality and fantasy, there is also a very high likelihood that you will begin to have people who taint the sciences and expertise, that someone then becomes their own version of an armchair expert. Well, I shouldn't do air quotes around that. It's like it's an armchair expert because they're biased. They're now they're seeking kind of a confirmatory bias to prove their point. And then science itself and expertise itself begins to erode. And then you can't redeem anything, because now there's a schism even within expertise. Well, I've got the experts over here that say one thing, and I've got the experts over here that say another thing. That's one of the most dangerous positions a society can be in. So there's a cascading effect here. There's already a little bit of a crisis of how and when we turn to experts in science, expertise in science. And now there's an extra risk that those themselves will become increasingly tainted because of the psychology of the day. So it's a little bit of a scary state. I mean, it's always been kind of sad, if not insulting in some ways, but now it's getting legit scary of like, can we maintain ourselves sufficiently and weather this storm and come out the other side and grow and begin to again pull up the importance of science and expertise? Remember, not worship it, but respect it, and respect it in a way that benefits our society proactively, so that the next time we hit crises, assuming we can get out of this one, we'll be better prepared. And so I anxiously await to see if that's something that we can do. So I think that's it. Just kind of a state of existence. Kind of curious what other people think and feel. But it feels like a couple decades, a slow crawl to get to this point of crisis, and we really need to do something more serious with it. And really take a hard look at ourselves and what are we deconstructing around us? Because deconstruction, I talked about this in one of my episodes. Can't remember, Change Over Time or something like that. No, it wasn't Change Over Time, but self-destruction, my self-destruction episode. It's important sometimes for us to cut, because sometimes we'll create infrastructure that's too heavy or overcomplicated and we need to cut it back. But it feels like we're at this point of like, let us cut off the healthy aspects too. Just destroy it all. And I hope we can come back from that seeming brink. So a little bit of a perhaps darker episode, but I appreciate you, as ever, listening and watching. And, well, this is particularly important in this moment. Do please stay curious.